If you love travel and you love wine, you are my type of person. And you're also Nick Elliott's type of person. Because in this episode, I'm speaking with my client, Nick Elliott, the host of the Pour and Explore podcast, a food, wine, and travel podcast. I have so much fun working on Nick's show. I learned so much about wine from it. If you don't know, I am an aspiring wine snob, and Nick is definitely helping me get there. But his podcast is fun, it's relatable, his stories from his own life, which he has so many. And he is a sommelier, a chef. He does a lot of amazing things. And this podcast is not only his passions coming to life, but it's also what his business is. So let's get into this episode because I think you're really going to enjoy this one with Nick Elliott, aka the Wine Guy. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hey, Nick, welcome into the Podcast Cafe. I'm so excited to be talking with you today.
I'm happy to be here, Haley. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I ask all of my guests is, what is your go-to coffee order?
My go-to coffee order. Well, it's kind of boring. It's simple black coffee with a little bit of cream.
Okay, I love that. I feel like I should ask you what's your go-to wine order?
Oh, well, that's more difficult to answer. My wine mood depends on my mood. So
Mm,
and of course also what I'm eating and lots of different things. So I love just about every wine. There's not a wine that I can think of that I dislike. And I keep a bunch of different things around the house. And of course, going out, I always like to try something new. So I guess the big answer would be something that I haven't tried before. How about that?
okay, I like that. I like that. That's how I'm trying to approach my wine era, is just
Yeah.
trying a bunch of stuff. I know I like a Pinot Noir,
Hmm.
but I'm just now venturing into the white wine world,
Okay.
which I feel like normally when people start drinking wine, I don't know, you tell me, but they usually start with white wine and
That is pretty typical, but you know
yeah,
what? You
somehow I
drink what
skipped
you
that
like.
phase and yeah. Well, that's the whole premise of your podcast, Pour and Explore, is
Yes.
drink what you like, you know, match whatever wine to whatever food, travel however much you want, and just experience life to the fullest. And I think that's something that I love about your podcast is you bring on these really cool guests. You have these really fun conversations. You bring stories from your background as a sommelier to, you know, your travel experiences and like you've lived it. So now you're here to teach about it. And I really enjoy working on your podcast. So why don't we just start with you telling us about Port Explore from your point of view?
Sure, absolutely. The story begins probably summer of last year or maybe spring of 2024, and I was actually doing through Eventbrite, I was doing live wine and food webinars, where people could come and ask questions, and of course I had an agenda, and they were about an hour long, and it was a lot of fun, and the viewership, would go up and down and so on. And, it wasn't after about 6 or so months, it wasn't as fun as it was anymore. And my wife, Hunter, one of your clients, or one of your ex-clients at least, she suggested that I roll that over into a podcast, which I was apprehensive at first, thinking about everything that goes into that. But it actually has been a really fun journey for me. The podcast is called Pour and Explore, a wine, food, and travel podcast. So I'm taking in all all of my business background and kind of rolling it into the podcast. So I am a certified sommelier. I'm also a classically trained chef through the CIA, and then I am a world traveler as well. Because I own my own business, I can pretty much work from anywhere. So one month I might be in Paris, and then next month I might be in Germany, or wherever the case may be. We love to go to Mexico, so I love all three of those things, so I thought it'd be really fun to kind of blend them all together and find some great guests. And it's been pretty successful so far. I've been really enjoying it.
Yeah, no, and something that you recently started doing was with podcast episodes is offering like your last one about cheese and wine pairings.
Hmm.
Like if someone emails you, you'll send them a guide of cheese and wine pairings. And, you've done that with quite a few of your episodes. And I really love that. What kind of response have you been getting?
The response has been good. I wouldn't say it's been great, but it's been good. I'd like to, figure out a way to kind of put more of a point on that, during the
Mm-hmm.
episodes. But the way, as you know, the way that I've scheduled the podcast episodes, I will do an interview with a guest, and then I'll do a solo episode, which is typically about a very specific topic. So the cheese topic, for example, it was a whole 30 minutes about cheese and pairing wine with cheese and talking about cheese and how amazing it is and all of that stuff. And I thought it would be a fun idea to pair that episode with a little my guide to cheese, if you will.
Yeah.
And then the episode that just dropped recently is a rosé episode, rosé wine. So I wanted to do some of my favorite rosés along with that. So little things like that, a little added value, something people can click on and say, oh yeah, that's cool, that's a great idea. I should try
Yeah.
this or I should try that.
Yeah. And speaking of your guests, you have really interesting topics that you cover, everything from digital nomads to chefs to, cheesemakers, like everything across the board. And I think when people start podcasts, they're worried about finding, you know, the right guests for the
Mm-hmm.
topic. How have you gone about finding your guests?
My favorite way to find guests is to post on podcast forums, on podcast groups on Facebook. That's
Hmm.
a great way to
Yeah.
find people, not only finding guests, but also the ability to be a guest on episodes. I find that I've gotten a lot of really great people from podcast Facebook groups. And then, of course, I know a lot of people in the industry as well. So, being able to find a wine expert or a chef or the like is not necessarily hard. So I've had some of my friends slash acquaintances on the show over the last. So I'm on month 7 right now, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's been a lot of fun, and I would say I've not been overwhelming myself with having to find guests too, just by the natural cadence of the show. Is
Yeah.
since I'm doing 2 guest episodes a month and 2 solo episodes a month, that makes it a little bit easier for me. And my recommendation to anyone listening would be to absolutely reach out to those forums. Hashtag need a guest on Facebook is also a great place to look, as
Hmm.
well as Instagram and TikTok.
Yeah. And what I really like is how you do cover variety. I mean, your podcast is specific in what it talks about, right? Wine, food,
Yes.
travel, but you don't limit yourself to who you're speaking to. You had someone who talked about cigars, and that episode
Hmm.
did really well. You had a coffee episode, which I loved, which I'll put in the show notes. I feel like it's very on brand for my
Yeah,
theme.
yeah, yeah.
That was, so it's not just wine, food, travel, like it is to an extent, but it's interviewing people in these different industries and being open to explore what that could potentially mean.
Yeah, when I put feelers out for guests, I say very generally this is what the podcast is about: wine, food, and travel. I definitely include hospitality in that
Hmm.
as well, overarchingly. So it's been relatively easy for me to find guests because, everyone's got a travel story. Everyone's got a favorite meal or glass of wine. I just did a great interview recently, which hasn't aired yet, that she and her husband, the interviewee and her husband, they travel the world, and the thing that they do every place they travel to is taking cooking class. So there you are at taking the travel aspect of things and the food aspects of things and putting them together. And then we can do the same thing with wine and food. We can do the same thing with wine and travel. So I like having those very overarching conversations.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm sure you're learning a lot from your guests too, even though you've
Absolutely.
been, in this world for so long.
Yeah, 100% is, and I love learning. I love traveling. I love experiencing new things, and I encourage my guests to do the same thing, to make sure that they're getting out there, whether it's to the next town over or to the next country over, it doesn't matter, get out of your little bubble and go explore something.
Yeah, I think especially in this day and age where we all don't seem to understand each other very well, it is great to be able to get out of our bubbles and,
Yeah,
explore what else
absolutely.
is out there for sure.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact quote or who said it. I think it may have been Mark Twain, but he talks about, travel being the very best education.
Hmm.
And I completely agree with that. You're not as well-rounded of a human being as you could be without getting out of your little box. And again, whether that's going to a different state or a different country, a different hemisphere, whatever the case is, get out, explore, see what other people are going through, positive, negative, in between, and just seeing their lives through your lens is very helpful. And I don't think we do enough of that as people.
I agree. I agree. And beyond your podcast just being these great, fun conversations of adventure, this is what you're using to grow your business. So, from a business standpoint, growing the Wine Guy brand, I mean, beyond just the podcast, you're using clips for social media,
Mm.
you're hosting a few retreats coming up. And
Yeah.
how is the podcast supporting those marketing efforts?
Well, yes. So I've been diving into the social media thing. It's not my
Mm-hmm.
favorite thing in the world, I'll definitely admit that, but I've found some tools, that have been really helpful to kind of speed up the posting process and making it more palatable for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as far as business wise goes, it's definitely, and which was my goal at the start, was to put me at the forefront of wine people on the internet. I want to be the go-to expert when it comes to questions about wine and food pairings, things like that. So in doing that, I've been able to increase my followers. I can't say that it's definitely had a direct correlation to improving business, but I know that I am getting out there and
Yeah.
seeing more engagement and things like that. But again, it's still kind of early, for me too. And with your help, I've been finding great little ways to tweak what I'm doing, and with every little tweak, things get better and better and better. So I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, 7 months sounds like a long time, but in the podcast world, you're still just getting started. I mean,
Yeah.
you've been doing this for years now, like what you're talking about, but the podcast world, it is kind of a slower marketing tool, but I do see it pay off in the long run just
Hmm.
because brand building and having connections and conversations is never a bad thing. And that's what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point from earlier is the learning, the education, the
Hmm.
continuing education for me, speaking to chefs and the way that they're doing things, speaking to winery owners and see the way that they're running their businesses and so on is helpful to me because it keeps me on the finger of the pulse of the industry. So, things that are trending and things that are posh now but might not be in, 6 months from now, hearing it from the inside is really cool, and that definitely helps me be a better wine guy.
Yeah, and I think having people on the podcast, you get to be a little bit nosier too. At least that's how I feel. I'm like, so asking these deep questions that if I was just at coffee with them, they might think I'm crazy. And they might think I'm crazy in the podcast too, but at
Yeah.
least it's recorded, so we can go back and listen. But no, I love that kind of point of view of staying on top of things through these interviews and these other experts you're speaking to.
Yeah, it's really a lot of fun, and my industry, it's a fun industry. It's an
Hmm.
industry with a lot of smiles that go along with it. Not every podcast out there has the lighter feel that I do. I'm also a little bit in the coaching world, so I get a lot of coaching podcasts through my feed and things like that, and a lot of times those subjects are they're down here, they're not up
Yeah.
here as far as
Yeah.
the feel of them go, and that might be harder to find guests, if you're talking about loss. Or I just did an interview recently with a gentleman who is supporting men's mental health. That was not a very light episode for me, but we
Right.
also talked about bourbon and stuff like
Okay.
that. So balancing those things out, I also think is very important.
Yeah, I agree with that. And even though your podcast is like lighter topics, like, yeah, it's not about like loss or grief or anything like
Hmm.
that, there is still a tone to the podcast. Like, there
Hmm.
is, when someone comes to your show, they know what to expect. And I think that's something with these lighter podcasts that people might not think too much about when they're starting is like, oh, I want to talk about wine.
Hmm.
But when you started your podcast, you knew exactly what point of view you had on wine, right? Like
Hmm.
making wine not snobby,
Right.
making, doing what you want. Just like we talked about earlier, is like you wanted to make this podcast approachable because just like, any topic, you could take a serious stance on wine, like talking about the rules that I'm sure people hear, or yeah, there's different ways that you could have approached it, and this is the way you approached it. So when you were planning, what in your background do you think pointed you to the view of wanting to start this like fun, do what you want type of podcast?
Sure. Well, candidly, that's always been my approach to wine.
Mm,
I've been in the hospitality business for almost 35 years at this point. I've managed restaurants, I've owned a winery, I've made wine, I've run wine tasting rooms, and so on. And for me, it's always been extremely important to come at wine from a very approachable point of view because there are a lot of podcasts out there, to your point, wine podcasts in particular, that are very, you know, this is this and this is that and this is the way it should be done and these are the glasses you should use and
mm-hmm.
yada 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 and all of that stuff, which is great. That's one way of doing it, of course, but I want to make wine, again, specifically, I want to make it accessible to everybody. And if especially the younger generations that are coming up, the Zennials and the Millennials are now drinking age or approaching drinking age, and they don't want to hear some snooty Pinot Noir. You can only drink it out of a bowl, and blah blah blah, and and all of that stuff is, and again, frankly, I don't believe any of that stuff either. Is my motto is you drink what you like and you enjoy
Yeah.
it how you like it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you like white wine with your steak, you know what? Fantastic. Good for you. If you prefer red wine with your whitefish, I'm all about it as long as you like it. And that is, I make the joke a lot that when I'm home here, I typically drink my wine out of a jelly jar. I'm not using fancy crystal glassware, and things like
Yeah.
that. Jelly jars are perfectly fine for me, and the wine tastes great, and
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I was about to say, like, I don't think I'm at the point. I live alone in a one bedroom apartment. I don't think I'm at the point in my life where I can have various wine glasses for
Right. Exactly.
different wines, you know? You gotta drink it how I have it, right? If I have friends over, like, I'll host a lot of girls' nights and
Hmm.
I'll be like, all right, so you guys get paper cups because I ran out of my wine glasses and
Yeah.
come early if you want one of the wine glasses or bring your own.
That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I take the same approach with food as well. I think food should be very approachable and, not avant-garde, whatever you want to
Hmm.
call it. When I was a professionally a chef, that is the way that I approached my menus as well. Just very down to earth, comfort food, easy to eat, no foam, no, wild garnish on it and things like that is just good hearty food that, you're going to leave a place and say, "Wow, that was really great."
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I'm just curious, what type of food is your favorite to cook?
You're asking the hard questions, Haley. Um, I would say if I like to produce anything more than anything else, I would say it would be Italian food. Just the layers of flavor and the
Hmm.
sauces and all of that stuff to go along with it. I definitely enjoy, doing that very much. But I'm pretty proficient in Mexican, Asian. I just made beef stroganoff last week, so a little Russian food as well. So it's just it depends on my mood.
Yeah, I love it. I love that. I mean, and then, the topics you cover on the podcast when you're planning out like the summer for the podcast or the guests, I like how you kind of organize them in a way. How do you come up with the topics for your show?
Well, it'll will always start with a guest. It will, well, if we're talking about my guest
Hmm.
episodes, it'll start with the guest. I'll put it out there, and again, they're going to come back and say, I just did a great episode again that hasn't aired yet, but it's coming up soon with a nutritionist.
Mm.
And when she approached me about being a guest on the show, I said, well, again, the show's on the lighter side. I don't necessarily want to talk about nutrition, and all of that stuff. But, would you be interested in talking about, mindfully eating and mindfully eating while traveling and, how to extend your food lifestyle from your home environment to your travel environment and things like that. So she was very receptive to that.
Hmm.
And we did a great episode about eating abroad, while still
Yeah.
being relatively healthy and mindful, about doing it. So it typically starts with the guest, and then I'll find an angle that works for the show, and then I'll build my questions around that angle. And sometimes and I don't say one dimensional in a bad way, but it's wine focused, or food focused. But I would say that with most of my guests, I'm able to kind of bridge at least two of my main topics,
Yeah.
during those things. And then as far as my solo episodes go, for me, it's whatever I just happen to be interested in
Hmm.
that month. So again, the rosé episode, we're in the height of summer right now. So the rosé episode just aired last week. It's all about rosé wine, where it comes from, how it's made, how you pair it with food, all of that kind of stuff. Cheese harvest is coming up, so I've got a whole episode about what is fermentation and how fermentation works. So things like that I find very, very fun, and I try not to dork out about it, but I also try to be very, very informative at the same time.
Yeah. Is there a lot of research that goes into the episode planning?
Yes and no. I try to do topics that I am well versed in,
Yeah.
so I actually sound like I know what I'm talking about. And then if there's a question that I don't know, I'll go to ChatGPT or Google, to
Hmm.
find out the answer. But I would say up to this point there have not been many topics that I've needed to do a ton of research on.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to approach things. I think that's an easy way to burn out in podcasting is if you try to talk about things you're not too well versed in. Of course, to
Hmm.
an extent, you can do the research, but I find that when people are starting podcasts and they're like, I want to talk about this and this and this, and they're not quite, they haven't been doing it for too long,
Sure.
that's where they burn out, right? Like the research part of it. Because
Oh yeah,
you
I
are,
can
people
imagine.
are, yeah, people are coming to you as the experts. There is that pressure to make sure it's right and also like put your own twist on it. But I love that you're doing these topics, and I don't think that you'll run out of topics anytime soon.
I should hope not, and the other thing for me is, making sure that I'm not doing too many similar shows in a row. So I
Hmm.
also try to break it up to where I'm talking about wine and travel one week and then I'm talking about food the next
Hmm.
and kind of breaking it up so it's interesting to the listener as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And when you were starting your podcast, I know Hunter connected us and
Hmm.
she was like, "Hey, can I refer you to my husband?" And I was like, "Absolutely. He's talking about wine and travel and food. Like, yes, thank you." And Hunter's podcast was so fun too. It was a business astrology podcast. I miss
Yep.
working on her show. Maybe she'll bring it back someday. We'll see.
I'm hoping, yes. Well, we'll see what happens. I know she would like to,
Yeah,
so
it was so
we'll go from
fun.
there.
Yeah, but did you ever do interviews or any host anything in the past?
I mean, beyond the thing that I was doing last year,
Mm-hmm.
no. I host a networking event once a month on Alignable, which is kind of LinkedIn Light for those who
Mm-hmm.
don't know what Alignable is. And I've never been on the radio or anything like that, if
Okay.
that's what you're asking. No.
Yeah, okay. I love that. So I'm glad that, I mean, I've loved working on your show for the past seven. I didn't realize it had been that long. Wow. But
Yeah, I think we're on episode 32 right now, I think is going
yeah,
out this week.
yep, yep. No, that's incredible. Well, I have some rapid fire questions for you, but before we get into that, is there anything you want to share about your experience working together or just anything in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you that working together has been awesome. I love the systems that you've set up to make things flow very easily, where all I have to do is just drop, information into ClickUp, and next thing I know, I've got a podcast episode. So that's very, very cool. And you've been really helpful with helping me design the look and the feel of the podcast. And we just had a great conversation recently about how to possibly start monetizing and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. So, you are definitely a wealth of great information. I appreciate working with you.
Oh, well, thanks for saying that. I'm excited to get into this rapid fire section with you. I just have a few questions, but we'll get right into it.
All right, let's do it.
So, number one is what was the first podcast that you ever listened to or remember listening to?
I've got a friend who's a disc jockey, and my very first podcast episode was listening to his podcast where he talked about the DJ entertainment industry and just having fun and so on. And as someone who comes again from the hospitality and a little bit of wedding background as well, it was fun listening to that.
Oh, that is
I
really
don't think
fun.
it's on anymore. I no, I don't believe it is, but this was years ago.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. What are some podcasts that you currently listen to?
I tried to listen to a lot of wine stuff. I've met some great podcasters, who have been guests on my show, so I've been
Mm-hmm.
listening to their podcast. There's a great one out there called the Red Eye podcast, which is all about the podcast host. She's a former flight attendant, so she's got lots of great travel stories and mishaps and all of that. So that's a fun one to listen to. And then I listened to a few podcast as well, learning, trying to absorb more information about being a successful podcast host.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool. No, I know the flight attendants probably have like the craziest jobs out there. There's
Oh
so
yeah.
much that we don't see that they're having to deal with, and it's pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
Allie came to the show with some very fun stories, and her show is a hoot.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Definitely. Okay, do you listen on Apple or Spotify?
I'm an Apple guy, so it's just easier for me just to click the little purple icon and go from
Mm-hmm.
there.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, what advice do you have for other podcasters?
Yeah, embrace technology. I don't think you can. Well, you can podcast on the cheap if you wanted to, but I think it's going to look cheap if you do it that way. So, invest in some good equipment, camera, a great computer, all of the little devices, recording devices, and all of that stuff. It really is worth the money. And then software is also a big one, so things like Descript, Squadcast, and so on are great tools of the trade. So I would try to embrace that as much as possible. And
Yeah.
I'm trying to take my own advice and really do a deep dive into social media as well.
Yeah,
But it
no,
is
I
my
love that.
nemesis.
It's okay. I just got off a call with someone who she wanted help promoting her podcast, and I was like, "Okay, what do you do?" And she's like, "Nothing. I don't promote it." And I was like, "Okay, well, are you open to it?" She's like, "No, I don't want to do anything." And I was like, "We're just gonna argue on this call, then, I guess."
Why are we here?
I don't know. It's very interesting, but no, I think that the efforts that you're making to promote the podcast are definitely there's something that the clips, the video, all of that, like those things do pay off and they compound, right? Like it's something that continues to work for you as you have more and more episodes. So I just have one last question for you, Nick. I am
Sure thing.
curious, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
So, and this is something that I've been struggling with for the last couple of weeks. And as the person who edits my episodes, I'm sure you're going to feel what I'm saying is, I thought I was a much better public speaker. I've discovered that I am, on doing the podcast, even with a outline script and so on for me, there's a lot of ums and ahs, that still come out in when I'm doing the episode. So I'm really trying to work on that, and I'm kind of embarrassed about
Oh my
it.
gosh, don't be embarrassed.
That's because I can stand in front of a room of 1,000 people and talk about wine, or whatever. I find myself stumbling over my words a lot more than I'd like. So
Hmm.
that's something that I've learned about. But a great podcast producer and some great software will definitely take care of that.
No, I mean, I like the way that you explain things. I think that you're doing great on your podcast. Is there anything like exciting that you've learned about yourself through podcasting too? I mean, if you're already doing like cool events and everything.
Yeah, I like meeting people.
Hmm.
It's one of the reasons that I love to travel, so much and get out there and do wine events and do wine tours and things like that because I love to hear other people's stories because getting from A to B at least once is hard enough,
Hmm.
but getting from A to B, multiple times over your career is difficult. And I love talking to people about how they move from A to B, and whether it's a struggle or whether it was super super easy. That's been the most helpful for me, as an entrepreneur, is hearing other people's views on business entrepreneurship and
Yeah.
so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Nick, normally I end the podcast with that question, but I have one more I want to ask you.
Hit
Two
me.
more, actually, and they're travel. I want to hear about where you had the best meal of your life while traveling, and if you could leave us with a fun travel story. I'd love to end the podcast with those things.
Sure, the best meal. I don't know if it was necessarily the best meal I've ever had, but it still lives in my head rent free as one of the most interesting meals I've ever had. It was the first time I ever went to Costa Rica. Costa Rica is an amazing country, by the way. The people are awesome. The food is mind blowing. Of course, you're surrounded by water on both sides and mountains in between, and it's just this really really gorgeous country. Anyway, so we were driving from the San Jose airport in Costa Rica to our destination on the coast, which was about a 2 hour drive. And we stopped for lunch in between. And it was this little shack that dogs running around and cats and and I think there were
Mm-hmm.
goats and all of this stuff and the driver said, "Don't worry, trust me." And we got in and we ordered our food, little chicken and beans or whatever, a little salad or something like that. But then when we sat down at the table, we got there and there was this little dish on the table and had this relish in it. And come to find out that this relish is called chilera in Spanish, and it's pickled vegetables made with banana vinegar. So
Hmm.
vinegar made from bananas, and then they
Okay.
pickle these vegetables. And I'll tell you what, it is to this day one of the most delicious things I've ever had in my life,
Wow.
to where I've even made it at home before. I've sourced banana vinegar, which you can't really find in the States,
Right.
and made it, and it is absolutely delicious. So that's a very, very memorable food experience, for me. Just this little roadside shack,
Mm,
with dogs and cats and eating this stewed chicken with pickled vegetable. Yeah, really, really good. Really, really
that
good.
sounds delicious.
Travel stories. I mean, again, I've got 1,000 of them, but one of my most recent favorite travel memories is we were in Bordeaux, France for 2 weeks. This was back in May of this year, but we stayed in Paris for 5 days before we went down to Bordeaux. And we actually got to see a good portion of the city of Paris by a golf cart. So we rented a golf not we rented a golf cart and we drove
Yeah.
around by ourselves. It was a guided tour in a golf cart, and flying through the streets of Paris, seeing all of the the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower and all of the beautiful buildings and churches and things like that on a golf cart. That was a lot of fun.
That sounds so fun. I'm heading to Paris in September for just 2 days. My cousin lives there, so he told me I could stay with him in his ratatouille size apartment. So we'll find out what that truly means. But uh,
Send pictures.
oh, for sure. For
Right.
sure. I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, we've had plenty of friends stay. And I look up like the ratatouille apartment. Funniest clip I've ever seen. And I'm like, all right, great. So I'm going to have to maybe try to do that while I'm there. That sounds so fun.
Yeah, yeah, that's a fun trip, absolutely.
Yeah, no. Well, Nick, where can people connect with you? And just thanks so much for being my guest on the show. It's been so fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, social media wise, you
Hmm.
can find the Real Wine Guy on TikTok as well as Instagram, the Wine Guy group on Facebook. I'm sorry, the Wine Guy page on Facebook, and the website can be found at thewineguy.vin. That's V as in Victor, I N as in Nick.
Perfect. I'll put all of those in the show notes. And yeah, I'm excited for people to come and listen to your podcast and learn all things wine, food, and travel from you.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Haley.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind the scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the